Hello, hello. Let's see if this is transmitting. Um, YouTube says excellent. Okay, great. So it seems like we're starting. Um, Let me just see. I will, I guess, mm, I'll do this. I'll remind people on social media, and then people can join. Moment. Um, Let me. Okay. Well, I did what I could. I did what I could. Um we're starting. So welcome everyone, and we're going to be talking about a number of issues that I want to dive into. So let's see. Today I'm going to be talking about a series of issues that I have something to say about, but due to the new format, it's not convenient for me to do these small extempore videos. So I wanted to comment on a few of them here, and since I had to delay my Guénon video, to the great dismay of Peter Hubner and some other people who had told me that they were quite excited, and since I delayed that, I decided to do this live today. So this is available to everyone, but I will be cutting this up into smaller bits and publishing the videos as the week goes on. But anyway, if you're here, you can ask me questions, and I will also answer those. Um, let's proceed then. Okay. So first of all, thanks to all the patrons of philosophy. You make this possible, right? You people who are either supporters or students of the channel. I couldn't invest the time that I do doing this if it weren't for you. Thank you very much for your support. Um, Now, today's subjects. So, first of all, I'm going to be talking about why learn canonical hermeneutics, right? Or allegorical interpretation is another reason. There's another word for that. So, what's the point? I did a video a couple of weeks ago about why consult an oracle, and so this is something more or less in the same vein. So, why trying to give explanations for these things that were once considered like basic skills, basic parts of education? What part do they have in, what role do they play in the good life? Then I'm going to formulate some thoughts about philosophy, polytheism, and initiation. This is connected to my recent readings of Guénon, and I want to answer some questions that we often get as polytheists about, well, how can you be a polytheist? How can you be a pig? How can you follow Neoplatonism as a spiritual path if there is no initiatory chain? If you did not receive this revelation from another living person who explained it to you, then I'm going to answer Connor Stark. So, like a month ago, I guess, I had a number of, I had an exchange with Connor Stark on Twitter, and I didn't have time to fully explain what I meant, and so I want to get back to that today. And then I want to tell everyone about the new course that's available, which is the Homer course. Then we're going to do a language barrier. I'm probably going to take a break. And then we're going to go into a question about Mário Ferreira dos Santos and about unity that the student sent me. I'm going to do another video for my Sexo series where I talk about sex and nudity. And then I'm going to talk to you guys about my new table of translations, right, which is available on my Google Drive. I shared it on my social media. So yeah, that's what we're going to be talking about. Okay, good. So let's just jump right into it, okay? So, why learn canonical interpretation? Right? So, what do I mean by canonical interpretation? I mean the kind of interpretation that was common in antiquity, in the late ancient world, where certain works were deemed to be divinely revealed. So, for some people, this would have been the scriptures, like for Christians, and so that would have included both Jewish texts and also more recent Christian texts interpreted as a single unity. For other people, it would have been Homer. It could have been Orpheus or the Chaldean oracles. So there were a number of different bodies of text that they were judged to be, in some sense, divine revelations, and this involved interpreting them in a super charitable way, right? And before I get to like what it means to interpret super charitably, I want to mention just like what's at stake here. So the basic idea is that learning to read these texts and oh, wait a minute. I just remembered something. I need to start recording. Okay. So what is canonical interpretation? Canonical interpretation is a practice that existed in late antiquity, exists in some way since to this day, which is that some texts have a canonical status or authority, very often are considered to have been divinely revealed, and and their status, their authority implies interpreting them with the most, uh, with the greatest possible generosity, right? So you want to interpret these texts in a way that is as charitable as possible to their authors. So what does this mean? This means holding on to the idea that this is one text. This is certainly a very disputed claim when, for instance, your authoritative corpus is something like the Bible, which includes many different books. This is all these texts cohere with each other. They're all true, right? So anything that is in these texts that is said to be that is said to be false or that seems prima facie false. So, for instance, the account, I don't know, in the book of Joshua that um, that God made the day last longer and kept the sun from moving, or the account in I don't know, the Iliad, that Diomedes somehow struck a goddess, right? Anything that seems prima facie false needs to be reinterpreted and given often what's called an allegorical interpretation, an interpretation that goes beyond a surface literal meaning referring to perceptible realities, in order to show that there's actually something true being said under this false screen or veil. The text is entirely well ordered, right? So there is no confusion in the text. When the author uses words in a certain word order, this includes some secret teaching, or that we're supposed to understand something from it, and we certainly aren't supposed to say that the author is somehow confused, right? And so also the words are always well chosen. They're they're uniquely appropriate to what is being described. And the author had complete control of this text, right? So this might not mean the human author. The human author can be conceived as it were, a mere mouthpiece. But the ultimate author, which can be a god, for instance, um, knows exactly all the details of the text, from global issues about the order of this text down to the most specific issues of pronunciation. Right. And finally, this text speaks to us. It speaks to every reader at every moment in time, right? It says nothing that is irrelevant or mere curiosity. So that is the idea of canonical interpretation. It's this way of reading, for instance, Homer that you find in Proclus, or that or reading the Christian scriptures that you find in Evagrius or Origen, or also how Neoplatonists, especially after Plotinus, so starting with Iamblichus, read Plato. So and this can be seem very arcane. We're used to um, different kinds of reading texts in order to find out the layers of meaning in them and see how those clash, to find the history of the text, to find the critical voices in a text. This is a very different kind of reading, one that is often leads us into, as it were, metaphysical or religious digressions, especially when there's something prima facie false that then calls for an allegorical reading. So, what is the purpose of of learning this kind of interpretation nowadays? Well, I see an important role for this in allowing us to interpret our own experience, right? So we often have a complaint nowadays that we are not taught how to interpret what happens to us, right? Things are taught to us. We are taught the explanations of things. We are taught the mechanical reasons why things happen, but the meaning of the events in our lives is obscure. If you want to find the meaning of events in your life, you might go to a psychotherapist, or you might go to an astrologer, or something, and then you will get specialized in help in interpreting the meaning of your life. But this is something that usually we have to seek out as individuals. It is not something that is systematically provided to us. Now, in learning how to interpret a text like this, interpreting, for instance, a text like the Odyssey or the Iliad, which is a rich, colorful, concrete text, which is full of, perceptible details, but also things that are contradictory and that we don't really know how to work with them. Finding out how to see this whole text as having a single meaning, and having and being able to solve all these contradictions, and to see the meaning behind them, and to also see the meaning behind these little contingent decisions about using this word or that word. This is, as it were, a training ground for what Greek philosophers called our nous, right? So, or nous, depending on your preferred pronunciation. So, our capacity for intuitive insight into truths that are not accessible through perception, be they moral truths or theoretical ones. The, in the interpretation of these texts was somehow a training ground for our nous, in order for us to then use our nous in the great text, which is our experience, right? And this is also involves this last point that I mentioned about how these texts speak to us immediately. And I think this is also true, for instance, in astrology, right? This is especially true in astrology. So in astrology, we are, learning how to see the world symbolically. And it seems that from the beginning in the astrological tradition, l- learning how to read charts went together with learning how to interpret difficult texts, and learning how to interpret them super charitably in this way. Because as Chris Brennan has discussed in his videos on the different methods for calculating the master of the chart, right? It seems that the original text, the foundational texts of Hellenistic astrology, which were ascribed to Hermes, Petasiris, and Nechepso, were very difficult texts even for the ancient astrologers. And they came out of reading these texts with very different ideas of how to calculate exactly this master of the chart, and especially something connected with it, which was the length of life method. Right? And this also has to do with the different house divisions that eventually get developed in astrology. I'm gonna put a link to this video of Chris's in the description. But anyway, so it seems like from the beginning, astrologers were faced with a somewhat cryptic text that they had to apply this hyper charitable kind of stance to, that like this was some kind of revelation, some kind of these texts had some kind of divine authority, and astrologers like Firmicus and Valens, they have their readers swear oaths of secrecy as they're learning these secrets of initiation of astrology, and and so at the same time that that they had these texts that they had to interpret hyper charitably, like it's a confusing text, but I have to make the best possible sense out of it. They were also doing the same thing with charts, right? And with charts, we do this kind of thing all the time. So it's like, how can it possibly be that this person, on the one hand, has an indicator that they're going to have success in their in their love life? They have like they're both benefics, say, in the seventh house, which has to do with their love life. But at the same time, the ruler of the seventh house is like the worst planet in the chart. So how do we make these two things go together? And it's basically the same kind of thing. It's like, how is it possible to say both that Homer is telling us always the truth, and Diomedes really did strike Aphrodite, and yet it's also the case that Aphrodite is a goddess, and goddesses should not be able to be hurt. Right? So it's the same kind of ability that we train in reading canonical texts, in that we and reading them in this allegorical, hyper-charitable fashion, and that we use in astrology, and that we use more generally in like seeing the events in our life as omens and as significant events. So that is, as it were, my idea for why it still makes sense and what's important about learning this mode of canonical interpretation. Even if you don't belong to a religious tradition that this kind of faith in this kind of text, we can still learn from these methods of interpretation and apply this in our life to interpret our life as as a coherent whole, and therefore to experience the world as having an important, important content, an important and true and good content for us to absorb and incorporate into our lives at all times, right? So this is why you should learn canonical interpretation. Thanks. Okay, so that was my the first segment. For people watching, you're welcome to ask questions in the chat, and I will then reply to you in between in between segments. Okay, let me just I'm pretty sure that uh um I'm pretty sure that anyone can chat since this is a live this is a public live, but if not, let me see. Let me just check to make sure that is not everyone able to participate in the chat? I apologize for this. Um, I'm not really sure where I can change this if it isn't if everyone can't participate. Um, okay. Well, okay, great. Thanks, Esteban. Let's go. Okay. So our next segment is about philosophy, polytheism, and initiation. So let me start recording again. Okay, so Polytheists often get a question, which is that you can't be a polytheist. You can't really worship the gods because there is no historical link between the communities that worshipped the gods that you say you worship, like Zeus and Athena and Aphrodite, or Mars and Quirinus, or whatever your reconstructed, I use that in a wide sense, tradition is, and today, right? The chain of initiation is broken, a sense, these kinds of ways. Use and of course, this isn't true for every um, polytheistic tradition, and sometimes you will get uh, people from other polytheist traditions, sometimes being appreciative and talking to uh, Reconstructionists in a broad sense, favorably and cooperating with what they do. But sometimes, like on Twitter, a while back, was it Blue Sky? There was a very nasty post by someone from an African diasporic tradition who was claiming that Hellenic Reconstructionists were all LARPing. And that is, a very unfortunate kind of interaction that uh, is rather pointless. And I wanted to address this. So, I mean, it's also this kind of complaint also comes, for instance, if you read René Guénon, right? René Guénon will insist on the need for people to be in a regular chain of initiation, right? And this is the reason why Guénon and perennialism in general um, stresses the need to participate and to be a member of a traditional religion, even one that they consider that has degenerated badly, like Catholicism or something, because they think that there is still the tradition is still latent, is present in a latent form. And well, what occurs to me is that Plato, in his texts, he clearly compares philosophy to initiations, to the mysteries, right? This is a common thread in Plato's texts. And the Phaedo in philosophy is said to be the true purification. In the Phaedrus, the vision of the forms through dialectic is said to compare to with the epopeia, the vision at the end of the mysteries. That was the culminating point of the mysteries. And it's, of course, not just Plato, right? So Parmenides' proem was uh, included a description of being led to the edge of the world, crossing into the world, to the domain of the dead, right? Oh, mortal, you are no ill fate has brought you here, and there receiving a revelation from a goddess. Um, and even Aristotle, in his book Alpha of the Metaphysics, he writes that, we could not have wisdom if the gods were jealous, right? So the generosity of the gods for him is a precondition for the possibility of first philosophy. And Stoics were involved in, for instance, etymological analyses of Greek words and of like interpreting Hesiod because they had this idea that there was a direct correspondence between as it were, language and nature originally, and so they too had this. Uh, Strongly religious component in their philosophy, not to mention the importance of oracles in their conception of fate. Even the Epicureans, held the gods um, as models of sagehood. What is the point of all this? The point of all this is that philosophy itself styled itself as, in some sense, a divine revelation is grounded in the gods, and especially Platonic philosophy did this. And so, in principle, if we have philosophy, we do have a form of initiation. Now, one of the reasons that people ignored this or ignore this is because the tools for, as it were, taking the polytheism and taking the piety of Greek philosophy seriously were mainly developed by late Platonists. And in the early 20th century, there was this idea that late Platonism was some kind of Oriental infiltration into the rational Greek spirit. And that their ideas that Plotinus is ascent to the one, and that later ideas about theurgy, these were all non-Greek ideas that entered into Greek philosophy. So even Guénon mentions this in his Crisis of the Modern World. He talks about how the Alexandrine philosophy tried to rehabilitate the Hellenic spirit with Oriental borrowings. Now, this is just old history. It no longer holds. We can find motivations for most, if not all, of the developments of the later Greek philosophers in the Greek tradition itself. And also, we don't hold into to this idea of hermetically distinct cultures. Also, that doesn't hold so much water. So this whole conception of Neoplatonism as an Oriental grafting isn't um, uh, isn't necessary anymore. So we can see that their account of philosophy as itself being a divine revelation, Plato as the greatest theologian because he explained things dialectically, is something that we can, as it were, take as proper to philosophy and not something that is alien to it and extrinsic in some way. So philosophy itself can give us access to the gods, right? And so when we read all this stuff about, oh, how philosophy has its roots in a religion, we shouldn't necessarily jump to the conclusion, oh, therefore, since religion is corrupt nowadays, we can't do philosophy properly, or, oh, I need to join a religious tradition to do philosophy. No, there is something divine about philosophy itself, right? And to this, there's a comment um, by Guénon in one of his uh, books, I think it's in the Considerations on Initiation, where he said, look, this is just like a law of nature. Same way that it is a law that you cannot be born without being born from the mother, though we could imagine, we could imagine people being just born from the earth and things like that. So also, it's just a law of the spiritual life that you have to have a spiritual father. You have to be initiated by someone. Now, fact of the matter is that the Neoplatonists address this directly. Um, in Plato, there is a myth about a time when people were born out of the earth, right? He takes up this mythical trope from the Greek ideas about autochthonous human beings who were born from the earth, and he incorporates this into his myth about who is the true statesman in his dialogue, The Statesman. And there he talks about how at one point the world has two kinds of periods it goes through. It has the period where which is like the one we have now, where we grow older and older and older, and we are born from other human beings, and and we die of old age or we die violent deaths. However, and this is the period when the gods have somehow abandoned us. We have abandoned the world to itself, and we have to fend for ourselves. However, this is in contrast to the period when the god directly took care of the world and everything went backwards. The stars rose in the west and set in the east, and instead of us being born children and getting older and older and older, we were born from the ground fully formed and became younger and younger and younger. Right. And so so he's dealing precisely with the question. Or he puts the question, is there a situation in which human beings are not born from other human beings? Now, when Proclus addresses this text, he says that this is not about actually two periods of the world. This is about the bodily life, which is the life under fate, which is the life of where we get older and older and older, as opposed to the spiritual life, where indeed we get younger and younger and younger, and we are born by ourselves from the ground, right? He interprets this being born from the ground as a metaphor for death, right? We are born from our bodily tombs. And and therefore he connects this with the Phaedo, right? So this is all in Platonic Theology, Book 5. And he connects this with a Phaedo, therefore, which says that the philosopher actively wants death, right? And so we might need parents in order to be born, but we sure as hell don't need anyone else to die. This is our natural fate as human beings, and the philosopher embraces this. He sees that this our being towards death is actually an opportunity. He incorporates this in his ascetic life to separate himself from the body, and he doesn't need someone else to do this, right? Of course, having teachers helps. In principle, the teacher does not pour in knowledge from the outside, but merely stimulates what's inside. So the Platonic philosophers themselves did not believe that you needed, as it were, initiatory parents. But rather they thought that philosophy itself is a divine gift and that reason itself can lead us towards the divine. Right? And you don't need the data of historical tradition. This was one of the things, the subjects in my discussion with Edward Butler last year about whether we can have nameless gods and whether they can be gods with overlapping domains. Well, but there are gods with overlapping domains, everyone agrees. But in my solution to what this means, I came to the conclusion that there can be nameless gods, or in line with my more recent series, nameless titans, right? So, like the sun, we have a direct access to the sun, even if we don't have a specific name or myth or right to it. And it is the sun in its foundational role for human life and experience, and all life and experience, which is divine, right? Which is titanic. And um, therefore, the world itself is always speaking to us. Why do we need these specific historical traditions? Of course, they can help, and of course, there is the theoi are working through them as well, but there is no actual need for this. The the world is so beautiful and it is so infused with divinity and meaning that we are not bound to this historical determinism. Okay? So that is my initial answer for the question about whether we can actually truly access the gods today, even if we have not received an unbroken historical link to the first communities that were inspired by them, right? Inspiration is not something handed down historically. Inspiration is something that fills the whole world, that fills the cosmos, and reason and philosophy can purify us to become apt vessels to absorb the divinity of the cosmos and to become its heralds. Okay, that therefore is a spiel about this. So Dionysius Bromios, you mentioned that in the Cratylus, Plato asserts that those who are good and noble now participate in the lineage of gold, and attaining this status involves becoming a daimon. That is, cultivating a knowledge and virtue to partake in the divine distribution of good and noble fate. Yes, and that is another question about these interpret that the narratives of, for instance, the four ages of men, the gold, silver, bronze, metal. This is not something that people always took literally in historically, but rather were spiritual interpretations of this is that there are always the four races of men, right? And it just depends on right, and these describe four levels of spiritual attainment or of moral attainment. And and in general, this is, what's irritating about the narratives of decadence. Narratives of decadence are usually describe the present well, in the sense that yes, it is very hard to lead a spiritual life, and we have all these obstacles, and we have obstacles specific to our time. What narratives of decadence get wrong usually is the past, right? They usually get wrong about how this has always been difficult. And, if you read the Platonic texts, hoi polloi are, subject to to the sensual life and perceptions, and they are far away from philosophy, far away from initiation, and this isn't because of, oh, Greek culture was degenerate or something like this. No, this is, this is part of the structure of the world that uh, the ultimate foundations of reality are hard to access, right? And we can bewail this, or we can see its true meaning, and we can, like Odysseus, join ourselves to to Circe, right? And make our peace with transmigration, make our peace with the agents that transform men into beasts, right? And we can, and if we do that, if we join Circe, then she will help us get to Ithaca. She will help us arrive at the intelligible. But if we stay here complaining about her, we're gonna stay pigs. So I'm sorry, I got a bit carried away. Um, let's carry on. Thanks for that, Udis. Um, so now let's talk about answering Connor Stark. It's a new segment. I'm gonna start recording again. So Connor Stark wrote on Twitter. Both Biovaltis and Gersh think that what is distinctive about Christian theology, that is Pseudo-Dionysus theology, viewed from a Platonic perspective, is the effective Trinitarian collapse of the first and second hypotheses from Plato's Parmenides. This seems plausible to me. This all seems plausible to me, Antonio, and it's basically the received wisdom that I received in my education. But Jonathan Gregg had an important point to make. So this was in March 4th, so it's about, I guess, yeah, 20 days ago, almost 3 weeks. And he said, yeah, sort of, though I don't think it's unprecedented with Proclus Henads. We kind of collapse the first and second hypothesis because qua ones, qua Henads, they belong to the first, and so all the negations are true of them. But insofar as they're causes of being, the affirmations are true of them. And this is perceptive, and he mentions Tim Rigg's papers on this, and this will be somewhat in line with my own answer to Connor, and and we'll get to that. But I want to recognize John's point here about how already in Proclus, in some sense, the affirmations and negations are said of the same. He said this explicitly, right? And that is actually why, because if it was just a completely different subject, then you couldn't use the first hypothesis as a giving you the unhypothetical first principle, which you will then use in the second hypothesis to derive all the orders of the gods. So in some sense, it has to be about the same one, but also in some sense not about the same one, so that you don't get a flat contradiction. And so Proclus was already joining the two, and that, of course, can explain how maybe a Christian student or a Christian reader of Proclus would then go further and then join the two and collapse them. John then had a quote tweet, right, about this. I mean, Connor went on to elaborate in a quote tweet. Consequently, given this collapse, Dionysius is able to attribute Proclus' eros pronoetikos, providential love, to the one itself. For Dionysius, it is possible to say the one God loves you. This collapse thus grounds a priori and in concept of love the very possibility of the incarnation. And then he had a print screen here of the German of Biovaltis' text, which he translated here. So Proclus, however, transfers the providential and loving behavior of the gods towards their creatures, which is realized in the realm after the one, not to the essence of the one itself, because its absolute transcendence, despite its universal causality, could be compromised by engagement with what is caused. The one itself remains amigues, unmixed, as the nothing of all things. It does not mingle with anything else. As such, it would also exclude an incarnation, which would be the result of an actively loving self-giving to created beings. Right? So that so far by Avaltis. Now, um, I observe, Proclus explicitly denies that exercising pronoia involves any mixes. Pronoia belongs to the henads strictly as henads, as agathotos, right? And Conor asks, but does it not? But does it belong to the one? I think that's Spiraval's point, that it does not. Okay. So here I want to pause and just explain what I'm thinking of here. I'm thinking of Elements of Theology, Proposition 122. So in here, the what does Proclus say? I have my translation here. So all that is divine and that exercises pronoia for secondary things um, also transcends the objects of pronoia, and and the pronoia does not weaken its unmixed and unitary superiority. Here he uses amicton, right? So it is amiges, right? Nor does its separate union, right? It's choristehenosis, do away with its pronoia. Now, I keep using pronoia because pronoia is explicitly said by Proclus not to mean providence. So he does not think that pronoia is any kind of divine plan that exists prior to things. It is not any kind of knowledge or anything like that. It is rather the activity of the unities, qua each of them is a good or value, of bestowing value on other things, right? Just by being a value, you are therefore a standard of value for other things, and therefore other things gate value by you being you, right? That is the exercise of pronoia. It is what Vicente Ferreira da Silva, as far as I can tell, understood as fascination, right? This primordial establishing, prior even to the establishing of the cognitive and ontological categories of the world, of what is desirable and what is not. And so it is this expression of value um, in a pure Grundstimmung, to use Heidegger's terminology, which of course is then articulated in providences, in noes, in nous. So that's what pronoia is in Proclus, and he makes this explicit point here in Proposition 122 that pronoia does not involve any kind of mixus. So the background to this is his idea that Plato steers a via media between Stoicism and Aristotle, right? So the peripatetic view is that God does not exercise providence. He only knows himself. He does not know any lower things. He especially does not know any mortal, perishable things, and therefore he preserves his transcendence. But there is no pronoia. And the Stoics managed to preserve Zeus. Um, Planning and coordinating and exercising providence, so exercising his loving care on everything down to the smallest detail, but then Zeus is conceived as a body fully mixed with everything else. And so Proclus wants to steer Vidia Media between these two things and say that um, the gods, they do exercise pronoia, but they don't get involved in mixus. This ends up being very like the Aristotelian answer. Okay, this is like he is exaggerating the distance between Plato and Aristotle in this, especially if you think of Metaphysics Lambda, that the first unmoved mover moves as something that as an object of love, And I talked about this with Yitzchok in my class on Proposition 122 in the Elements of Theology course. You can check that out there. But in any case, so he doesn't think that exercising pronoia involves any mixes. So this uh, quote by Baltus is kind of not terminologically exact. Um, and um, Also, the henads are not after the one. Connor asks, well, but does it belong to the one, right? And it would seem that maybe, in some sense, insofar as like I'm fine with an interpretation that says it doesn't belong to the one, that you have to be an agathotes, so a particular good in order for you to exercise pronoia. I think there's some sense in that, because, but on the other hand, insofar as we can say that tohen is to agathon, and to agathon, qua to agathon, um, bestows value on other things or is the ground for all values, that will be an exercise of pronoia for purpose. So um, you could maybe say that. But now I replying to Connor, I said, but the Henads are not in the region after the one. They're precisely on the same level. Or even better, if you are thinking of the one as prior to beings, you are thinking of the Henads. If you are thinking of the one itself strictly, you should not be thinking of anything else. The one is certainly not God. Not to attribute pronoia to it is not to deny pronoia to God. As for the incarnation, I don't see how it's schologically distinct from the embodiment of the cosmic gods. To this Connor said, well, I wouldn't presume to have grasped the nuances of the Henads and the One as you and Edward Butler have done. But I did find some statements in the Elements Theology, for instance, Proposition 133, that seems to suggest that the One is a monad over and above the Henads. For not all the gods together may be matched with the One, so far does it overpass the divine multitude. I'm sure you have a way to make sense of this passage and others like it so as to preserve polycentricity. But it is in this sense that I see Dionysius as introducing pronoia into the monad one. The Henads would then seem to become the divine processions, pre-existing in the one for D, hence the collapse of hypothesis 1 and 2. It seems to me that this would be logically distinct from the cosmic gods who fall upon their Henad and are in their Seira. So there are a few confusions here and things that I want to clear up. So first off, me and Butler actually have different views. We're both polycentric Platonists, but we ground this differently. And so, for like some of the arguments that Butler uses for this, I don't think are good arguments for it. I have different arguments. I have different stresses, and we also have different ways of solving these kinds of problematic passages. And so, for instance, I think you can talk about the one itself, right? That's like part of what I said here. I think, and whereas Edward will at times have sentence like the one is nothing but the Henads or something like that. Um, of course, those statements themselves are not all of Edward's position. And other times he'll say no, but the one is the principle of individuation. Right? And so what I said here is that you cannot think of the one and anything else at the same time. Right? So there is a one itself, but it is not a as it were, coordinated, good not terminology here, with anything else, be due to its unity. If it was coordinated with something else, as it were, in effect, then it would no longer be purely the one, it would be a cause. It would not be alone, right? It would be with something else. So, as if you're thinking about the one itself, strictly, you should not be thinking of anything else. Now, Connor points to Proposition 133, right? Proposition 133, which indeed he's what does Proclus say? So he says, so this is at the end of Proposition 133, and this is a proposition which um, claims that, the distinction between the unity itself as tagathon and the henads as agathotes, right? And this is actually a good proposition to say. Proclus thinks that the one exercises pronoia, right? Because he says, "Dio kai tagathones ti ekeino hos pases agathotetos hypostatikon." I'm sure that Conor, with your Polish Greek, would pronounce that much nicer. But my point here is the following sentence, which is what you brought up, right? So he says, and I'm translating, for unity, right, ex so exceeds the multiplicity of the gods, right? Um, that not even all of their existences, all of their hyparxes, could together um, be equal to unity. Right? What did you say for not all the gods together, maybe matched with the one? So far does it overpass the divine multitude. I think that's Dodds. But there are a couple of things here. So first off, this could very well be an echo. I think this is an idea that Christoph Helmich had. This could very well be an echo of Iliad Book 8, is it? The threat of Zeus, right? That if I let down a chain of gold and I was in Olympus and all you other gods pulled, then you could never make me move, right? And so that's one reason to give this a polycentric reading already off the bat. If that is the reference, he is describing the one with attributes of a particular god of Zeus, right? So this is grist for the polycentric mill, that the one is actually, he's treating a god as divinity itself, as the one. Now, I prefer to interpret this in a different way. So I have the it is a position of my own, and this is a place where I disagree with Butler, so he disagrees with me on this, that I think God and Henad mean different things in Proclus. So a God is a Henad together with all the things that participate in it. And together with all the things that participate in it in the strict sense of Proposition 64. So, of course, everything that has a symbol of a god participates in some way. So cocks, right, roosters, they participate in Helios because they have a synthema of Helios. However, Proposition 64 talks about the difference between um, participants participations that belong to their participants, and participations that make their participants belong to them. Right. So, for instance, the difference between a self-subsistent nous and wisdom in a human being, right? So, a self-subsistent nous would be, for instance, the nous of a daimon, right? Which makes that psyche, that immortal life or soul, belong to it, and the soul of a daimon is practically just an instrument of that nous, right? Whereas um, the our souls, we are not always wise, right? And our wisdom is something that inheres in us, and we are not mere instruments of it. And similarly, so the synthema of Helios in a rooster is something that depends on the rooster, right? The rooster has an independent existence. It is not immediately controlled by Helios. However, the body of the sun is immediately controlled by Helios, and it is immediately controlled by Helios because as a soul controls a body, right? So if you want to get technical, the soul of the sun controls the body of the sun. The nous of the sun controls the soul of the sun, controls the body of the sun, and Renad ultimately controls the nous, controls the soul, controls the body, and that makes it a single agent, right? That is the in cosmic god, Helios. And so if you say God, you mean a henad together with all its participants, right? So I don't think that you can make sense of, for instance, propositions 113 to 113 and 114 if you don't have this distinction between henad and God. Um, and that's all in my book, my translation. And I discussed this also in my conversation with Butler on shared domains of the gods. So what does that mean? That means that if Proclus says that for not all the gods together may be matched with the one so far does it overpass the divine multitude, he is not contrasting just the one and the henads. If he says gods, he means the gods together with their participants. If you're saying all the gods, then it means all of reality, because every chain in reality ends at an unparticipated monad, which is grounded in a henad, and therefore everything is meant, right? And so you are there is no moment where you have the one and the henads, right? Just the one and the henads. Rather, what you have here is one and all of reality, right? And all of reality is here encompassed with um, the in the phrase the divine multitude. And for this reason, I claimed, that the henads are not in a region after the one, as if you had the one, then the henads, and then other things. Rather, what he's contrasting here is one and everything else. And everything else includes the henads, but there's no moment in Proclus's system, so to speak, where you just have one in the henads. Um, that is um, that is not the case. Um, So this is how I solve this, and therefore the one is not a monad for the henads. The one is a monad for the gods, right? So I think that the one can be said to be a monad for the gods because the gods are that participated henads, including their participants, but not for the henads as such. Okay, and then, so I've already explained how, we can say that the one itself exercises pronoia. Um, but, and now finally, the incosmic gods, if I am not mistaken, Thomas Aquinas, he says that the incarnation is that the divine nature uses the human nature like the soul uses a body, right? And that is precisely the way that the Proposition 64 explains the relationship between henads and their participants, and therefore it's precisely the relationship between henads and their between cosmic gods, which are henads that are ultimately participated by bodies and their bodies, right? So I don't see um, a substantial difference here. So it's wrong to say that in cosmic gods follow upon their henad are in and are in their sera. And in cosmic god is a participated henad, right? So, and in the same way that, the Christ is the embodied word. And I don't see a logical difference between the incarnate word and the incarnate Helios, right? Um, the Platonists would certainly balk at the idea that a perishable body could be the vehicle for a henad. But the divinity of Christ would never be recognized if there were not a resurrection and therefore a glorious body as well. And that is not that question about whether if the body can be perishable is, entirely um, not a logical issue. It doesn't mean that there's a different logical structure between Helios and the sun and the word and the human nature, right? and whether then but then you might answer, but it's not the very first thing, it's not the one itself, that that is incarnate. Well, then you have to have some very specific theses about the relationship between the one itself and the henads. And I've just pointed to why I think that you can say that the one is the monad for the gods, but not for the henads. And so that's what I have to say to answer to Connor. Connor's a friend, and I just wanted to explain myself more at length here. Um, okay, thanks. Uh, stop the recording here. Okay, was that intelligible to people? Are there questions? Let me see here if we have. Yeah, we still have people watching. Um, okay, doesn't seem like there are questions forthcoming. You guys can always add questions or comments in the chat. I'm very happy to answer them during the live. Let's go. What's next? Ah, right. So I just wanted to announce that the complete course of Platonist Odyssey is available now, and so you can sign up for the course now and immediately receive access to all six lectures. So an hour and a half lectures discussing different passages of the Odyssey and the Iliad and how Proclus interprets them um, allegorically, and I managed to go far beyond what Proclus tells us. So, for instance, in the episode of Proteus and how Menelaus pins him down and force him to tell him the truth, Proclus only gives us an explanation of what it means that Proteus changes shape. But I managed to develop an interpretation of that. This actually must mean some kind of theurgic ritual, and I got the outlines of this of what this theurgic ritual is. Maybe it's some kind of ritual dialectic. You have to look at my classes to see. I went really deep into the role of philia in theurgy when I talked about Proclus' interpretation of Patroclus's funeral. And we saw how the episode on Mount Ida is actually right when the episode of Mount Ida when Hera seduces Zeus. This is really interesting because Proclus interprets it as a divine model for non-procreative love, right? Non-procreative eros. What is it about? That's what that myth is about. So I managed to really enrich our uh, I'm enrich my own understanding of these myths and go beyond what's just on the surface of Proclus's text. And I'm very grateful for people's interest in these lectures. And I may be re-releasing this maybe around the time when Christopher Nolan's film comes out, but for the time being, it's available. And please write to me, get in touch with me if you want to buy the course. It's all ready. Now we get into the linguistic barrier. I'm gonna take a break. So let's take a break for 10, 15 minutes, and then we will come back. Okay? Ok? Estamos de volta, agora em português. E vamos continuar. Vamos continuar. Então, um aluno, o Vinícius, alguém que estuda comigo filosofia, me mandou essa passagem de Mário Ferreira dos Santos, de seu comentário ao Parmênides de Platão, e também me mandou uma pergunta associada. Então, eu vou ler essa passagem, né, vou ler a pergunta dele, e daí eu vou fazer algumas considerações. Então, Mário Ferreira escreve: demonstra Platão que é que o homem capta em primeiro lugar, o e o bem, sem os quais nada captaria. Todo o nosso conhecimento, já o demonstramos em trabalhos anteriores, funda-se na captação do da unidade. Só a unidade pode ser objeto de conhecimento, pois o que não é, de certo modo, é nada. E o nada não pode ser objeto de uma captação. O que não é uma unidade não tem qualquer presença, e o que não tem qualquer presença é nada. Ora, se capto o verde deste objeto, capto verde. E se não é é nada. É, portanto, primeiro na inteligência. E bem se implicam mutuamente, como já o demonstramos em filosofia contrária. O ser supremo é em si e bem em si. O que o Vinícius me mandou, falando aqui no e o múltiplo do Mário Ferreira, sempre pensei no zero como puro potencial, talvez até ligado ao infinito, que sobre certas aspecto lógico é a representação do nada, já que ele é ausência de início e de fim. O é o que podemos conhecer do ser, mas não é o ser ainda. Em mim, ele está mais próximo do zero, infinito, do que do um. Fazer esse trecho me causa certa estranheza sobre o zero, porque realmente parece que quando eu digo que é o zero, parece que estou dizendo que o ser não é, só um é. Então, isso aqui é uma baita de pergunta, é um baita de assunto. Eu pessoalmente não gosto muito desse comentário do Mário Ferreira, especialmente quando ele fala, assim, trata certos argumentos no Parmênides como pismas, e ele me parece que não é útil ler um texto e achar que os argumentos dele são todos mal construídos. É mais proveitoso ler uma interpretação do texto que te mostra como que aqueles argumentos fazem sentido. E o Mário Ferreira frequentemente fica aquém desse tipo de comentário. Dito isso, eu acho que está cumprindo um papel bom você estar levantando essas perguntas para o meu aluno e para leitores, né? Então, ele está levantando essa pergunta aqui sobre, então, qual é a relação entre a unidade e o nada e o ser? Ahn, Agora, só para comentar um pouco aqui a intuição do Vinícius sobre o zero, eu acho que faz todo sentido a gente falar do zero como um símbolo, de certa maneira, do infinito, né? Porque quando que usamos zero, né? Nós usamos o zero quando nós representamos números por meio de né, uma quantidade fechada de algarismos, que daí diferenciamos o valor desses algarismos pela sua ordem, né? Então, nós temos aí, em princípio, um, ah, como se fosse uma série ordenada de posições para os números, cada um dos quais com um peso, né? Então a gente escreve nossos números em base 10. Então, né, mais à direita pomos as unidades, 10 dezenas, 10 centenas, 10 milhares e por aí vai. E se a gente se a gente encontra um zero, né, em uma posição, por exemplo, em 101, o zero nos indica que não há dezenas nessa quantidade. Mas a quantidade é feita por uma centena e uma unidade são 101 coisas, ou, é 101. E o zero, então, implica aqui apenas a possibilidade de uma quantidade, né? Então, nesse sentido de representar possibilidade, a quantidade possível, faz sentido aproximá-lo do infinito, né, do indeterminado. Ahm, Nesse sentido, eu vejo uma grande lógica, né, nesse simbolismo do zero corresponder ao infinito. Agora, devo dizer que e o, o Vinícius ele diz, não, mas espera aí, O infinito parece ser outra coisa que a unidade. Parece que se a gente pensa do ser, a gente pensa mais no infinito do que a unidade. Então, será que não seria melhor dizer que o ser não é de alguma maneira nada? Mas isso vai de encontro com o que o Mário Ferreira diz aqui, né? Em que ele diz que se algo não é um, não é nada, e ele faz uma correspondência aqui entre o ser supremo e o um. Agora, devo dizer que, como platonista, eu concordo com algumas afirmações aqui do Mário e outras eu acho ah, que elas não podem estar corretas. Am, quando o Mário diz que se algo não tem unidade, não tem qualquer presença, né, isso é perfeitamente platônico, isso concorda com a primeira proposição dos elementos da teologia, não existe multiplicidade pura, né? Am, certamente não tem nenhuma presença que tenha multiplicidade pura, né? Então, se a gente capta algo, a gente capta uma coisa. Então, tudo que há é um, de alguma maneira. Sem sombra de dúvida. Sem sombra de dúvida. Porém, quando ele diz que o ser supremo é um, né, e que só a unidade pode ser objeto de conhecimento, isso aí já é questionável. Porque a unidade em si, o um em si, não pode, na realidade, ser objeto de conhecimento. Justamente pela sua simplicidade, né, a, ele não pode estar presente em outra coisa na forma de conhecimento. Se eu conheço algo, tem algo em mim, uma atividade em mim, é ah, já que eu vivo uma vivência minha, que é idêntica, em certo respeito, a outra coisa. Né? Isso que vai constituir isso como conhecimento. Agora, se algo é simples, ele não pode estar presente em outra coisa. Né? E essa identidade entre, um objeto de conhecimento e uma atividade conhecedora, essa dualidade que temos em todo conhecimento, mostra que o conhecimento e as coisas conhecíveis são posteriores à unidade em si, que a unidade ela mesma não é objeto de conhecimento. E a unidade ela mesma não é presente, né? Mas ela nem por isso é nada, né? Ela é a origem primária de todas as coisas, tá? Ahn, porque ausência não é nulidade absoluta, tá? Existe a ausência no sentido de uma falta de presença, mas também as coisas que excedem toda a presença pela sua simplicidade também são ausentes. Então, nesse sentido, a unidade é anterior ao ser. E também o que é anterior ao ser é a infinitude enquanto tal. A infinitude enquanto tal, ela pode ser pensada, por exemplo, em uma pura multiplicidade que é só muitos, 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 sem começo nem fim. Isso também não pertence à presença, isso também é anterior à presença, né? Quem discutiu isso melhor nem foi Proclo, foi o neoplatônico posterior Damásio. Discutiu isso muito bem no seu Sobre as Origens Primárias, seu tratado sobre as origens, Periarchon. Ahm, então, é todo mundo para além da presença, para além do ser. E o ser, ele mesmo, ele é uma mistura da unidade com multiplicidade, da unidade com o infinito, ou do limite com o infinito, como o Próclo exprime isso. Então faz sentido ter essa ideia. Não, mas eu acho que talvez o ser seria mais bem representado pelo zero do que pelo um, ou o um, ou o um do que pelo zero. Por quê? Porque o ser justamente é a mistura dessas duas coisas, né? Am, nesse sentido, eu acho que, assim, há aqui realmente uma questão sobre, vamos dizer, o zero e o um como símbolos do ser, qual é mais apropriado. Eu diria que ambos são igualmente apropriados na medida que o ser realmente é a mistura do limite, a unidade, com o infinito, com o zero. Porém, Há argumentos para pesar para um lado ou para o outro, dependendo do nosso contexto e o que a gente quer enfatizar. E, ahm, e fora isso, eu diria que, porém, que o uno em si, o múltiplo em si, estão além do ser, e nesse sentido, eu eu me despeço do Mário Ferreira e a gente caminha por trilhas diferentes, partindo de um mesmo texto platônico, tá? Então, isso sobre o zero e a unidade. Ahn, temos algumas perguntas de clássicos rebaixados. Ahn, então, rebaixado pergunta: Fico pensando no zero no I Ching, que é um sistema binário 1-0. Nesse lance do Mário, ele parece confundir o número um com a unidade. E por isso, lance de dizer que o ser supremo é 1. Essa pura multiplicidade seria semelhante ao múltiplo do Badiou? Ótimas colocações. Então, primeiro, eu acho que essa coisa do limite do infinito bate muito com o que eu já li sobre o Yin e o Yang no I Ching, sabe? E eu acho super interessante pensar no I Ching como um sistema divinatório todo baseado nesse insight de que todos os seres são compostos de limite infinito, né? É algo que até onde eu sei nenhum sistema divinatório desse tipo surgiu na tradição grega, mas tanta afinidade com esse pensamento platônico pitagórico e o I Ching, que eu realmente acho que ele funciona como se fosse como uma operacionalização desse insight transcendental, né? Dessa análise do ser. Sobre se o Mário está confundindo o número um com a unidade, sim. Então, eu acho que um jeito talvez mais apropriado de entender o que o Mário está dizendo é que ele não está falando da unidade enquanto tal, a unidade que é discutido pelos neoplatônicos, torren. Ele está falando sobre hemonas, né? O que é traduzido como mônada e que eu traduzo como unidade de contagem, né? Nesse sentido, sim, o ser supremo, né, o ser enquanto tal, é a própria, a unidade de contagem original, né, no sistema de Próclo. Isso é o objeto do poema de Parmênides, né? Então, isso seria um jeito mais caridoso de interpretar o Mário, mas até mesmo aí eu acho que assim, na sequência, ele tem um argumento de por que o ser enquanto tal teria que ser idêntico ao ser supremo, e é um argumento que eu acho super suspeito com base platônica, mas esse seria outro vídeo. E por último, se a pura multiplicidade de Damasio é semelhante ao puro múltiplo de Badiou, então, eu propus uma vez para escrever um livro sobre isso com o Peter Hübner, porque ele estava numa pala de Badiou na época, e eu escrevi minha tese de mestrado sobre essa pura multiplicidade em Pro. Mas no final tem umas coisas sobre Damácio. De novo, Badiou está lendo os mesmos textos que o neoplatônicos, está lendo as mesmas hipóteses do final de Parmênides, e eles estão chegando a conclusões diferentes, mas eu acho que talvez haja jeitos de. Então, nesse sentido, é a mesma coisa, no sentido tem a mesma base textual. Eles certamente dizem coisas diferentes, agora se as coisas podem ser reconciliadas ou são irreconciliáveis são outros 500, é algo que eu acho que é algo que merece estudo, né? E daí seria uma ponte entre o tardo platonismo com o platonismo contemporâneo de Badiou, né? Que seria daí certamente, se houvesse uma síntese, seria certamente uma direção naquilo que o Peter Hübner chama de um platonismo pós-euclidiano, né? Então é isso, obrigado Vinícius pela sua pergunta. E eu parto para o próximo assunto. Ok. ahm, então, ficou faltando um assunto na minha série Sexo Gay é Bom, que é justamente o assunto da nudez. Eu prometi um vídeo sobre nudez no meu segundo vídeo, que foi sobre sexo gay e o olhar, né? A contribuição do olhar para o sexo. E eu não cheguei a voltar ao assunto da nudez, então eu queria voltar a isso. Então, a explicação do sexo como a realização das nossas capacidades cognitivas, em particular das nossas capacidades sensoriais, porque o outro ser humano é aquilo que a gente melhor pode conhecer por meio das nossas capacidades sensoriais, e especialmente outro ser humano que também está reciprocamente engajado em nos conhecer com todos os sentidos, né? Então, essa visão do sexo, isso nos explica algo sobre a nudez? Isso lança uma luz sobre a nudez? Eu acho que explica. E lança uma luz sobre o que podemos chamar de o paradoxo da nudez, né? Então, há um paradoxo na nudez que é o seguinte: por um lado, uma pessoa despida, uma pessoa nua, a gente consegue conhecê-la melhor. Ela não tem nada que a cobre. Por outro lado, uma pessoa vestida, a gente já conhece melhor. Porque vestimenta, sabe, transmite muito sobre uma pessoa. Vestimenta, frequentemente, é algo que essa pessoa escolheu, ela teve uma escolha de vestimentas, a partir de um certo nível de afluência, as pessoas conseguem escolher a sua vestimenta. E e daí, isso transmite algo sobre ela. E o jeito como a vestimenta é usada, é portada, isso transmite muito, a seu respeito. E nesse sentido, a visão da pessoa vestida é muito mais informativa, muito mais, cognitiva do que a visão da pessoa despida. E por isso também há tesão em ambas as coisas, sabe? Pensando o sexo como realização cognitiva, há um tesão na sugestão na pessoa vestida, porque isso sugere algo sobre a pessoa, a gente conhece a pessoa, e como é um exercício de conhecer uma pessoa da melhor maneira possível, então pode haver um certo ah, tesão na pessoa vestida. Por outro lado, como o melhor conhecimento é por meio do sexo, isso envolve o toque completo de corpos, isso envolve, então, invocar nosso corpo completo como coberto de pele e capaz de toque, então, também há um certo tesão em ver a pessoa nua ao mesmo tempo. Então, esse relato de sexo explica por que tanto pessoas vestidas quanto nuas podem evocar tesão, e daí explica também qual seria o tesão específico em despir uma pessoa, porque daí é um acesso a ambos os níveis, né, de informação, tanto um, da pessoa coberta quanto da pessoa nua. E, então, nesse sentido, eu acho que esse relato do sexo também lança uma luz sobre qual é o significado de estar nu ou estar despido para o sexo. Era só esse breve adendo que provavelmente vai entrar no livro que eu estou preparando como uma espécie de apêndice ao capítulo sobre o olhar que eu queria formular. Eu queria formular aqui num vídeo, porque todos os outros conteúdos foram em vídeo, então, para depois ficarem todos no mesmo formato oral, eu resolvi gravar mais uma coisa. Ok, então foi isso. Ah, e agora eu quero falar da minha nova tábua de traduções que está disponível no Google Drive. Deixe eu puxar ela aqui, então. Ahn, então, tem o novo índice e a nova tábua de traduções. Tô abrindo. Eu vou também fazer um novo coisa. Agora, bom, ahn, ok. Eu acho que agora estamos todos juntos e vocês conseguem me ouvir e ver os coisas. Então, deixa eu falar aqui do índice de traduções, tá? Então, tem duas novas coisas que eu providenciei online, vou pôr na descrição desse vídeo também, que são novas traduções para Proclo. Então, eu estou toda hora atualizando as minhas traduções, então eu pus uma versão atualizada. Isso foi a pedido do Peter Hübner, eu agradeço a ele por ter pedido isso. E também temos um novo índice de proposições. Agora, o índice de proposições tem lemas corolários e também inclui as novas traduções, né? Então, por exemplo, tem agora, você vai ter assim, aqui 14 né, a produção 14, ela tem lemas, e os lemas são 14.1, 14.2, e também tem corolários, 14 mais um, 14 mais 2. Eu fiz isso em parte também porque eu quero remontar o bot que eu já tive no Twitter, eu quero remontar ele para o Blue Sky para que ele tweete aleatoriamente proposições dos elementos. Ahm, então, aqui vocês têm acesso, então, a uma tradução completa de todos os enunciados dos, dos elementos, junto com a página que ele está na minha tradução e também a página do comentário sobre essa proposição, né? Então, você tem isso completo aqui. E isso é bom para você testar as traduções que você vê aqui. Então, por exemplo, aqui você vai ver algumas traduções ousadas do tipo Titã para Theos. Sobre isso, vejam minha série que terminou recentemente, o On Titanism, né? Sobre por que eu estou traduzindo Theos como Titã agora. Mas daí, claro, eu preciso traduzir também as coisas derivadas de Theos. Então, Theos, né, divino, que normalmente divino ficou titânico, mas Ektheio, né, então normalmente divinizar ficou atitantar, né? On, para, estou traduzindo com presença agora, então parousia virou adjacência. Tem várias coisas aqui. Ahm, e eu não quero hoje comentar nenhuma dessas traduções em particular, mas eu queria só avisar que, olha, isso aqui está disponível e para as pessoas acompanharem minha interpretação de prova no seu mais recente nível, no seu mais recente estado, tanto no nível dos termos individuais, quanto no nível da tradução das proposições. As coisas vão juntas. Então, por exemplo, uma coisa que eu faço quando eu quero ver, será que isso vai funcionar mesmo? Eu pego uma tradução nova, por exemplo, quando eu estava pensando, eu vou traduzir Theos por Titã, eu primeiro vi como que isso funcionaria nos enunciados dos elementos. Será que funciona? Será que soa bem? E como me soou razoável, isso foi uma das razões, fora as razões teóricas que eu tive para adotar isso, né? Então, só queria anunciar que tem esses novos recursos disponíveis. Ahn, justamente. A ideia é realmente uma ahm, coisa. Peraí, eu tô. Agora voltou para. Ah, desculpa. A live tava. Vocês estavam vendo os slides até agora? Ou não? Acabei de me dar conta que aqui no YouTube está registrando só barreira linguística, por alguma razão. Não, mas você teve aquele momento que tudo ficou escuro e tal, então deve ter avançado. Ahn, Ok, bem, eu espero que tenha trocado os slides e que não teve um erro aí. Ok. Ahn, beleza, então era isso que eu estava preparado. Sobre a ideia de uma live semanal, eu gostaria de fazer isso, mas eu tô sem tempo. Eu teria que calcular para ver assim, quantos assinantes eu precisaria ter para justificar isso. Mas eu gostei e é isso. Assim, uma coisa que vocês podem fazer para me encorajar a fazer lives semanais é me mandar perguntas, né? Me mandar perguntas, provocações, e daí eventualmente eu vou, vai acumular, eu vou querer reagir a tudo isso, eu vou querer fazer uma live dessas aberta. Isso é um jeito de vocês encorajarem eu a fazer a live. Outra coisa também é, né, quanto mais apoiadores eu tenho, assim, ó, nós somos todos de humanas praticamente, todos sem dinheiro, então eu entendo que Procon não é exatamente algo que atraia tantos assinantes, mas, né, qualquer apoio que vocês possam ajudar, né, daí eu posso dedicar mais tempo a esse tipo de atividade. Então, eu quero fazer mais coisa com mais platonistas, né? O Belo, o Peter, também ahm, o Butler. Vai sair uma entrevista que eu fiz sobre minha ideia de Theos como titã com a Dani Lane, né? A Cora, né? Tem o podcast dele sobre misticismo platônico e eu participei daquilo e isso deve sair em breve. Eu tô esperando eles anunciarem. A gente já gravou. Bem, a gente pode fazer só a webcam agora, né? Ahn, e, eu também quero fazer, eu também tô falando de fazer mais uma live. Eu fiz uma live com o Fernando Moraes, né? Fernando de Moraes, que a gente falou sobre tradução e o Brasil. E a gente está pensando em fazer uma live junto com o Ronald Robson, que lançou um ensaio recentemente sobre o Brasil. A gente quer fazer isso. E é isso, olha, obrigado pela participação e eu vou parar por aqui.